SECfans.com. Week 4 is here, and that means we're bringing in a computer model for the first week of the year, how to get a little bit of data going, but it also might mean that the data gets a little bit weird. It has so far in Game 1 and Game 2 that we've talked about this week. So Texas and TCU fans, you're probably not used to hearing from us. TCU fans heard from us last week, and y'all did such a good job against Ohio State. We wanted to talk about you again. We like to step outside the SEC one time per week and discuss a big game, and this one seemed like a fun one to talk about. I want to let everybody know that we would love for you to subscribe. We're actually going to do a live show, our first one, this Tuesday, 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern. We're going to talk about the week before, answer any questions that we see that come up in the old super chat. This is our first live show, so hit that subscribe button if you want to get a notification, a reminder that we're going to be chatting. You know what? Subscribe anyway. We are pretty objective. We're 17-7 so far this year against the spread. We don't really gamble, but we do like to toot our own horn when we do well against those guys in Vegas. So, and TCU fans will probably attest to the fact that we're pretty objective. We did get some things wrong about your team last week, and we're going to talk about that right now. All right, Josh, we both picked Ohio State in a pretty considerable blowout against TCU. It did not materialize, and some of it was because we got a little bit wrong on Shawn Robinson, and I'm going to offer this up. This is kind of a good olive branch to you TCU fans that didn't love what you heard from us last week. When we have a miss, we own it if we get the opportunity. We're going to own it right here. We saw a lot more from TCU than we expected. And I went back and watched some game film on Shawn Robinson in the earlier games this year. I didn't love what I saw last year in mop-up duty. And then we talked about his numbers against SMU. And yes, there was some bad weather for some parts of that game. And his numbers weren't great. But the numbers, it turned out, were not poor because of bad throwing. He had a lot of drops. He had about 70 yards worth of drops in the first quarter alone. And that could have been due to the weather. The way the wide receivers played against Ohio State, I think it showed that it probably was some of the weather or, whatever, just weren't into the game, whatever. But he was throwing the ball pretty well. He threw it pretty well, not amazing. And he had a good performance, a good gritty quarterback performance against Ohio State. It wasn't amazing. 7.7 yards per attempt. Some of that was because TCU had to keep pace with Ohio State with the defensive scores and ultimately the 40 points they put on the board. But 40 attempts for 308 yards is good, not great. He didn't really run it at all, and that is a dynamic that I think he can bring to the table when he needs to. But I just want to say we've been consistent on this show. And you can watch last year in our game. I think we did the second Oklahoma TCU game. We love us some Gary Patterson on this channel. So we always think that's a well-coached team. We didn't think athletically, or I guess size-wise, the whole use speed to neutralize size disadvantage would play out as well as it did against Ohio State, and it did. Okay, long open. I wanted to just clear the air with TCU fans, own the fact that we missed it because it was a tighter game than we expected. Still a double-digit win for Ohio State, but did not play out in any way the way we thought it would. So starting off, this is a big game. I think bigger because not just the fact that USC lost to Texas or Texas beat USC, because we were planning on doing Wisconsin and Iowa, and Wisconsin laid an egg, but also Texas actually won in convincing fashion. And USC, for all their flaws this year, and we discussed some of those in our Stanford preview of them, for all their flaws this year, they've got talent on that team. And so we saw the Texas that lost to Maryland, and everybody was immediately reacting to that game. We both actually picked Texas to beat Southern Cal when we discussed this after the show last week. We both thought Texas would beat Southern Cal and thought it was a pretty easy bet. Tell me, did we overreact to the Maryland loss, and now are we overreacting to Texas? We're not saying Texas is back. I know that's kind of a meme right now, but is there the potential of that we overreacted early and now we're overreacting in the other direction?
I think you have to be, honestly, because if you take a step back and you look at these teams objectively, Maryland is not a good football team, right? It's you can't tell me that Maryland is, you know, an excellent football team or a great football team when they lose 35-14 to Temple. And in the same vein, Southern Cal is a pretty good football team. They played Stanford close. We're always kind of iffy on the Pac 12. Their record in bowl games is not very good. Their record out of conference is not very good the past few years. Obviously, we saw Notre Dame just throttle USC last season, which was a bad sign. But I do think you can pretty safely say that USC is probably a significantly better team than Maryland. And if you just take that one data point, it's pretty obvious, right? If USC is a better team than Maryland, Maryland beat Texas, Texas thumped USC, one of those things doesn't quite line up. And I think a lot of Texas fans are kind of frustrated with the up and down performance that they're getting, and I think justifiably so. I think Maryland came into the Texas game extremely well prepared. They had a good game plan. They had a quarterback that was able to make some plays. We have a tremendous amount of respect for Matt Canada coming out of the SEC. We've talked a lot about the fact that Canada made LSU's offense able to score in games where they shouldn't have been able to score. And LSU beat Auburn last year pretty much entirely due to Canada game planning touchdowns into the game. LSU was not able to really consistently move the ball whatsoever. And the point I'm making from that is Matt Canada can sometimes allow his team to win a game that they shouldn't win by generating points.
One of the things that really impressed me with Texas, like I honestly think the 37 points far outpaced their offensive production. And we see that in a lot of games, and we like to talk about how, South Carolina last year they beat NC State, and it was hilariously imbalanced on the other side in terms of actual statistical performance. I was really impressed with their run defense in this game. So Ware, the running back for Southern Cal, we've been pretty high on since we first saw him. He's a good running back. Now, SC's got some issues on the offensive line, but, Daniels threw the ball 48 times, which I think is asinine. But part of it might be because Texas shut them down. They had negative point what was it, -5 yards as a team rushing and -0.03 per attempt. But when you have your two running backs have 10 combined rushes, that's not good. But it says something about a Texas defense that I don't think we've necessarily seen in the past. And they've had some good defensive games. They had a pretty good, I'm off the top of my head, I think they had a pretty good defensive game last year against Oklahoma. But one of the things we have seen is they've been able to score points without great rushing games from the running backs, without great passing games from their quarterbacks. Ehlinger, 223 yards, 6.8 per in this game, not great, still managed to put up 37 points. On the flip side, the one thing I did not love from TCU, who I felt in terms of defensive performance last year and this year, so far, I think TCU, even the 40 points is a bit of a weird one because of the defensive scores. I thought they played pretty well defensively, especially at least for 3/4, 2.5, 3/4. I thought they played pretty well. J.K. Dobbins is a really good running back. Mike Weber's a really good running back. But 6.7 yards per attempt has to concern you a little bit if you're TCU in terms of defense. And it might show what we were saying before in that when you're trying to use speed to neutralize size and athleticism on the other side of the ball, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. In this case, is there something to worry about if you're TCU in the run defensive game that maybe Texas doesn't necessarily have?
USC never tried to establish a run game, right? They threw 48 passes to 16 rushes, and that's including the 3 quote carries from the quarterback Daniel. So really only 13 true passes. Almost, as you said, it's asinine, right? That you throw 4 times as much as you run the ball in a game
With a true freshman quarterback.
with a true freshman quarterback. It's just stupid. And I personally take that as a little bit of an indictment of T. Martin and Clay Helton, but that's neither here nor there. what I saw on the perimeter a little bit was, Amon-Ra St. Brown is a phenomenal athlete, and maybe it's a one-off, but on the perimeter and some of those plays, I felt like the size was an issue for Texas. And Texas was able to attack the line of scrimmage. I'm not sure that's unusual because USC couldn't really win the line of scrimmage against Stanford or anyone else either. I was more really thinking about Maryland. Maryland was able to move the ball with a lot more consistency. Maryland did have multiple guys with 4 yards per carry or more. Ty Johnson wasn't terribly effective and was under 3 yards per carry, but Fleet Davis had over 4 yards per carry in that game, and again without huge chunk plays. So Maryland was able to move the ball again, and I think we do agree that Maryland probably wasn't really that great. So I think it maybe had more to do, as I said, with USC trying to out athlete them, and that reason I did on that whole tangent was to wrap back around to say, I think I said wrong what you just said, that USC tried to out athlete Texas and it didn't work. And they never tried to establish a run game. I'm not sure if they could have because they got stoned when they did try it, but they never tried. You can't, if you've run the ball less than 15 times in a ball game, you don't know whether you would have been successful or not, frankly. You're never going to be able to run the ball with much success when you're that infrequent or you're that inconsistent with it. And it may be more of an indictment in USC. It may turn out all this year that they're not able to run the ball. We're not quite sure yet.
So you touched on an interesting thing there with Texas having the athletes to maybe show some team speed that can run with a team that uses speed to create stress. And speed does that. Speed at every position, literally every position, like TCU has, does create stress, and it's a constant stress on both sides of the ball, but especially offensively. It's a constant stress that has a cumulative effect over time. And I think we saw that against Ohio State. Now, it's interesting that you mentioned Texas because Ohio State is one of those teams that also has a lot of team speed, but it's sort of concentrated in a few very important positions. Paris Campbell's super fast. He had that big play that showed that both the running backs are fast and also physical. But in general, I don't think Ohio State was really ready for the kind of speed that TCU brought to the table. And I could see some of that happening again against Texas. And tell me if this is fair. I don't think Texas has near the running back or quarterback room that Ohio State has.
I would have to say that's probably pretty fair.
And it's not, to me, it's not like, Texas can still recruit well. They're still Texas. They're still going to get theirs on that side of the ball, or I'm sorry, on that side of the element of this building a team. But I don't think they have a J.K. Dobbins back there, and he's not even just starting running back. I think the gap between Haskins and Ehlinger is pretty significant, and I think if I'm gonna tip my hand on my pick, I think that alone is enough to shift. If we took all the athletes from, well, here's a good way to look at it. If we had JT Barrett on this Ohio State game, in this Ohio State game instead of Haskins, is that game like super close? Maybe TCU wins?
I think, see, this is probably where I diverge from you, is I'm not so sure it's true. And the point I was making before is Texas, I think, defensively is successful because they're fast more than they're big. They're very disruptive. They get behind the line of scrimmage. And when USC went to a game plan where they tried to get it out to their athletes more often than not, rather than playing power football, I think it was a pretty significant mistake. Because when USC's running backs were in goal line situations and whatnot, Texas, I thought, had a hard time tackling them, frankly, on the edges. If JT Barrett is in the game against TCU, you kind of have a similar problem. Ohio State, I felt like, ran the ball really successfully and had good power. Dobbins is probably the more powerful back at this point than Weber. Weber's been kind of, his whole career, he's not quite lived up to his billing. And I think you'd agree with that, that Weber, when he's played big teams, has kind of disappeared and they've had to put Dobbins in. But when they ran with Dobbins with power, especially in the second half, and they went to more of a power game rather than their spread stuff, they had a lot of effectiveness. Again, 6.7 yards per carry, and without a big run, there's no 20 plus yard carries there that are skewing that statistic. With JT Barrett, they would have been a much more power run heavy offense. And I think that might have been better for Ohio State than what they did run, where Haskins threw the ball 38 times. And I just don't think it was a good game plan. We had over 300 yards. I get that, but they gave up a lot of disruption. And I think because they had big physical linemen, and they had some big tailbacks, that wasn't playing to their strength. It played to TCU's strength with smaller, more disruptive players. So I actually do think JT Barrett, I think you could have been as effective or even actually more effective in that game. And let me be very clear, not because of JT Barrett and how good JT Barrett is because in view of Haskins, but because of the style of offense they would have run with Barrett versus the style of offense they ran with Haskins and the matchups that creates against TCU.
Yeah, he threw it 38 times, but they also ran it 42. I mean, they ran 80 plays in that game. So I don't know. I think we're going to disagree there just because I get your point. And when a team is effectively running a power offense, especially against a smaller team, and we talked about this a little bit in the Georgia-Missouri game that we just discussed, how Georgia, if their running game is going, regardless of how many points that Missouri historically has been able to put up on teams because they have a high-flying offense, that power offense is going to be devastating to them because of the makeup of their defense. I see where you're going with that. Maybe it's just me being a little jaundiced because I think Ohio State is on another level completely as a team with Haskins. But okay, so let's get away from that a little bit and just go back into this game and these matchups. So do you think, based on what you've just said, that even though Texas has not been running it great, and we talked about how USC gave up 300 yards on the ground in UNLV, we talked about how Bryce Love, who was 1.2 yards per carry in the opener, ran for over 7 yards a carry against Southern Cal. Then we get into Trey Watson and Daniel Young having good, not great games against this USC rushing attack. Do you still think the play is a power offense against this TCU defense with the personnel that Texas has?
I do, and I'm not saying necessarily that it's going to be super ultra effective, but I think it's the most effective thing they have. Ehlinger and that passing attack, it's going to have issues if they try to go against a Gary Patterson defense and you ask Ehlinger to win the game with his arm and you open him up to a lot of disruption, because in my view, that's what Ohio State screwed up with for much of that game. And Ohio State, as good as they were, couldn't deal with the pressure that TCU put on them. And they really didn't pull away until they started playing power football. And I don't know that Texas is necessarily great at it, but I think they're a better power team than they are a, spread, cute pass team, however, whatever your personal perspective is on pass heavy attacks. I just think they're better at it, and I think it fits better with TCU.
So you say it fits better. Tell me how successful you think it's going to be, or would you rather just get into the model and tell us what the model thinks?
So let's get in the model, and then we'll sort of go from there. Looking, first we will have a video out either the day sometime around this video is posted. It might come a day later. We're going to explain the model and what statistics we use, why we use them. The intermediary statistics here, Texas is allowing 72% of opponent rush averages and 106% of opponent passing averages. TCU allows 95% of opponent rush averages and only 72% of opponent passing averages. So, in short, Texas is a pretty darn good team against the run, and they've been pretty shoddy against the pass. TCU has been 95%, by the way, is anytime you really want to be 90 to be good. So 95% is really not very good against the run, but has been 72% against the pass is excellent. So much better pass defense than a run defense. And again, that's not my own input. That's just Not even saying necessarily it's true. That's what the statistics say for these two teams. Extrapolated out based off past performances, it's guessing that both Texas and TCU will average 4 yards a carry, roughly. TCU will throw it better, 7 yards per attempt, than Texas will. It only thinks Texas is going to be able to get 5 yards per attempt. And the score output, it comes from that, is 41-37 TCU over Texas. Now, I need to give a huge caveat here. Every one of these models the first week, because, for example, with TCU, we only have 2 FBS games. I have to throw out FCS teams for a variety of reasons. Namely, their FCS data is built on playing other FCS teams, so it's not relevant to FBS games. TCU's offense scored more points in bad production against SMU than they did against Ohio State with better production. They had 6.7 yards per play against Ohio State, which is actually quite good. And that's a pretty high yardage number to only get 28 points in a game. Likewise, 42 points against SMU is really high for only having 5.5 yards per play. And a lot of that has to do with garbage time and the way games win in other ways, but that just sort of is what it is. Point being, this is a blind model. I don't want to mess with it. I want to use it as a baseline. And right now, it actually, as far as the computer's concerned, TCU is better when they get less yardage than when they have more yardage, which obviously can't be true, but that's the way the model views it. This happened last year with South Carolina in the SEC. South Carolina won a lot of games early where they didn't move the ball very well. When they started moving it better later in the year, they actually scored less. We had a lot of discussion on why that was. A lot of it probably had to do with the fact that they were going for big chunk plays early in the season with Deebo Samuel and a lot of other things where they were actually scoring more effectively. They changed their offense when they were moving the ball better, and it actually hurt them. I don't think that's the case here. I think it's just too small of a sample size, and the model's kind of freaking out a little bit. And if we played this game 5 weeks later, that would South Carolina that year, it smoothed out. It would do the same thing here. This is why we don't trust them until about week 6 or 7, ours or any other. But 41-37 TCU over Texas. Point being, they both run the ball about 4 yards per carry. TCU throws it a little bit better. And I honestly think it's interesting that it predicts 41-37, given that neither one of these teams is predicted to move the ball very well. 5.5 yards per play for TCU, on 4.5 yards per play for Texas. That's not great production, and certainly not what you would expect to get 30 to 40 points out of.
So we're only 3 weeks into the season. This is week 4. And one of the things that we look for are patterns with teams against poor teams. And if you're a good team and you play a poor team, you blow the poor team out. We don't like to do direct transitive property, so forgive me, but I'm about to go second, 2 levels deep transitive property. Texas beat Tulsa by 1 score. Tulsa is objectively a bad team. Tulsa beat an FCS team by 11, lost to Texas by 1 score, and then beat an Arkansas State team that we in the SEC have seen this year. Beat Arkansas State 29-20. And to score 29 points on Arkansas State is to not try. I know Alabama's offense is on another level right now, but Alabama could have legitimately scored 100 points on that team if they wanted to. And I might have said they beat Arkansas State. They lost to Arkansas State 29-20. So they scored 20 points on Arkansas State. I don't know if that says anything. I don't know if we're looking too deep, but we also saw Maryland get just skull dragged this weekend to a previously I think they were 0-2, 0-3 Temple, something like that. So we have one data point where they beat a USC team that we aren't super high on, but don't think is a terrible football team. And then they struggled or lost to actual terrible football teams. So does that tell you more than the model might tell you or the data might tell you? Or are we getting too deep in transitive property and too deep into looking at individual games that are their own thing, and we need to look more at the data?
It's tough. I think one thing I'll say when you look at that Tulsa game is you start digging into the stats. All of Texas's running backs ran it pretty well. They threw for almost 9 yards per attempt. Tulsa's main running back only had 3 yards per carry. The quarterbacks had under 6.5 yards per attempt. Statistically, they did pretty well in that game. The score really wasn't reflective of their performance, and we see that sometimes, that it just doesn't come out. My inclination, and I think maybe this is the point to sort of get into our actual predictions of the game. My inclination, based off what the data is telling me and everything else, is Texas did not score like they should have from their production, wasn't living up to their potential early in the season. That the results from the games were not as reflective of how good Texas was and what they should have been doing. That Texas is a better football team than they showed. They came out, I guess you could say it's a bad game plan or they were unprepared, but they managed to lose games when, honestly, they had about the same total yardage as Maryland, but they had over 400 yards of offense and they didn't score 30 points. And then in Tulsa, they seriously outgained Tulsa by 180 yards, and that ended up being a close game. And again, almost 500 yards of offense against Tulsa with only 24 points. So I think it was just a lack of scoring production. Now the special teams plays and whatnot against USC sort of artificially inflated the scoring, but I think Texas just had issues scoring early, and I think it's a little bit of an aberration. I think Texas is better than they appear on the scoreboard so far this year, and I think they may be turning the corner, and it terrifies me to say that with Texas, frankly, given their history, but I'm giving them a little bit of faith. I'm probably going to be proven wrong on it, and it's one of those things where I'm speaking, and I already know that this is a mistake, and I'm going to be wrong. I'm going with Texas 27-24, 27, TCU 24 in this game. I don't think it's nuts because Vegas has this as a pick 'em. So even if I'm wrong, that tells me I'm not completely out of my mind. And it really comes on to the fact that, I kept harking on it. Texas is holding teams to 70% of their rushing averages. TCU is a run-first team. Robinson is a run-first quarterback. Texas did pretty well when they were trying to be out-athleted by USC. I have more concerns with Texas when teams try to attack them more directly. TCU has struggled against the run, so I don't think Texas, if they have any brains, is not going to lean on Ehlinger. Texas, really, their Achilles heel is they've really struggled against the pass, probably what USC was trying to exploit, but they went way overboard in doing it. TCU is not a pass-first team, and I don't think they're equipped to be one. I think the matchup favors Texas, even though TCU is, and we say this a lot, I think TCU is a better team than Texas. I think the matchup favors Texas, so I still have Texas 27-24.
So this is where we're going to depart a little bit, and I think that, sorry, I'm pulling something up right now because I think it bears mentioning. I think that this, like we talked about in the Georgia game, where if I'm going to disagree with you, I think it's because you're being too honest to the numbers too early in the season, and you're a slave to the numbers a little more than I am, and I do the gut thing a little more, and it ends up generally biting me in the ass more than you. I think TCU wins this game, and I think they win it decently big. I'm going 31-20 TCU. One of the reasons is I actually disagree with you on Robinson. He didn't run it hardly at all against Ohio State. He threw for over 300 yards. Now, he threw for 7.7 yards per attempt, which wasn't great. And one of the things that scares me a little bit with TCU, picking them in this game against what looks to be a decent defense, one of the things that scares me is if you take away a couple of monster plays against Ohio State, what does that game look like? You can't count on a 93-yard run every single game. On the flip side of that, I think Ohio State is a much better team than Texas right now, especially offensively. And I think this TCU defense will frustrate Texas a good bit. And I'm going to go a little step further. I actually think that TCU is better than Oklahoma. The game against Iowa State scared the crap out of me if I'm an Oklahoma fan. Now, I think Oklahoma is still a very good team. I think that it's either TCU or Oklahoma is going to be in the playoffs. I've got some concerns with Oklahoma at on defense and at running back. Obviously, with the injuries at running back, lost just a huge blow to them with Rodney Anderson. And I'm not sold on Kyler Murray. Not saying that he's not great. I'm saying that they haven't played anybody, so I don't know. All that to say, I think TCU wins this game. I think it's a 31-20. I'm going to stick with it. I'm curious, though, how much do you think you're influenced, if at all, by the fact that TCU left absolutely everything out there, left nothing actually in the tank, put everything they had in this game, came up short, and they're going to be a little bit emotionally deflated going into a road game at Texas? Is it all numbers, or is some of that in the back of your mind, even subconsciously?
It's there a little bit, but I'll go one step further, and that's something that Ohio State's fans ragged us on mercilessly in our preview for TCU Ohio State. Is we called out the fact that Ohio State had had real issues in their prior games against running teams and giving up long run plays. And we got a million excuses from Ohio State fans on why the starting safety's out, what was early, it was the linebacker coach not doing a good job, they're going to be better, blah, 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 blah. And what did TCU do? They came out and they had long run plays that busted that game open. And one, I'm a little concerned, coming off a big game. It does have an effect. And we talk about this a lot, and I don't try not to discount it entirely. As you said, I tend to be more of a slave to numbers. I don't give, I think, what is it, Gary Danielson in SEC broadcast all the time will talk about the fact that he doesn't really buy into the idea of momentum. I'm not too different. I think a lot of times we ascribe things like momentum to other trends. In this case, in my view, I think Ohio State had a real issue and has a real issue with giving up big plays on run defense because they have a lot of young players in the back seven, some of which, frankly, probably aren't coached very well, and they have had poor run fits, and they're going to give up long plays. That let that Ohio State TCU game be a lot closer than it probably should have been. And outside those plays, TCU didn't run the ball well at all. I mean, Alanulua ran for 2.8 yards per carry. And if you take out that 93-yard touchdown run, what is that? Minus 60 yards and 11 carries. So you take out the one touchdown run, and all of a sudden you're running for about 5 yards per carry from Anderson too, just outside that one carry. So the point being, a lot of what TCU did in that game was really just a couple big plays, and otherwise the offense wasn't very effective. I think TCU is a little, as much as you said, people are going to look back at it. If I'm right in my prediction, or if it's even close, people may look back at it and say, well, they played Texas closer and even though they played Ohio State really close, and it was just the emotional game afterwards, it was going to be hard to win it. I think the real truth of the matter is TCU exploited a couple things against Ohio State, got some points up in that game, a couple touchdowns, without really being able to move the ball that well in terms of production, and sort of made themselves look a little closer to Ohio State per play than they otherwise were. And this is maybe a little bit more of a fall to reality. And I don't think it's a slide on TCU, and I don't want to take it that way. If there's anything from this discussion, I'm a lot higher on Texas than I think you are. And I think Texas may actually turn out to be a pretty good team, and I think people are overreacting to the first couple weeks. And I think Texas may end up being a pretty solid team this year. And because of that, I think TCU is going to struggle a little more than some people anticipate. Probably, in my view, I think they're actually going to score less points against Texas than they did Ohio State.
Yeah, I agree and disagree. I actually think Texas has improved. I think they're still a year away from competing for a Big 12 championship. I think TCU is right there. I really do, I think Shawn Robinson can throw it. I man, looking back at the SMU game, he had some great throws that didn't connect because he had some drops, and he had some good throws against Ohio State. So Again, it's early. It's still early. I know we use that excuse, but we're not halfway through or a few games into conference play yet. We're still guessing a little bit. You got anything else on this game, or are we going to let our our predictions hold up until the weekend?
I think we've beat it to death based off a very small sample size from both teams.
Yeah, that's the problem. So into the year, we're doing Big 12 championship game. We can talk for an hour because we got plenty of data, plenty to go on. There's still not a lot here, especially from the Texas side. I like what I saw from TCU, even in a double-digit loss against Ohio State. So there you have it, y'all. Give us a thumbs up if you like the video. If you love it, go ahead and subscribe. Remember, we're going to go live this Tuesday at 8:30 Central, 9:30 Eastern. If you want to tell us how we're crazy and how we're wrong. So both of us have the opportunity to get something from both fan bases this time since we picked different. That's always fun, too. So feel free to chime in. Maybe you can pit us against one another with your data and salient points. So thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.